If it wasn't for one man, one gym, Westside Barbell, a huge chunk of the strength world wouldn't exist today. Bands, chains, reverse hypers, box squats, specialty bars like the safety bar squat. Louie Simmons didn't just train freaks, he engineered the tools you probably use every single week. And more than equipment, it was his philosophy that literally changed the strength game forever. The fact that you can train strength, speed, and size all at the same time, that rotating max lifts weekly could bring insane strength without burning out, that the body needs variation, but the mind needs structure. From world record powerlifters to Olympic lifters to CrossFitters and natural athletes, Louis' fingerprint is on all of it, and we have to thank him a lot. And it hasn't stopped with him either. Many coaches have picked up the torch, carrying his lessons forward and evolving them from different sports, athletes, and goals. Now, I'm going to do my best, and I apologize in advance because I cannot do this man's work justice. But I'm going to today break it down, showing you how we adapted to real world performance, hypertrophy, resilience, and build some super freaky athletes. Let me show you how it works. Most lifters still follow a linear or block periodization where you focus on one trade at a time. But here's the biggest problem with that. When you're building peak strength, you often lose speed. When you're building peak power, but your joints hate you after 6 weeks, or when you're focusing on muscle growth and you just lose that pure peak output, we often find that those qualities, which we've been working really hard to keep or build, actually start to disappear. And the conjugate method was designed to fix this. It was born from Soviet sports scientists and weaponized by Louie Simmons. It trains multiple strength qualities simultaneously, and it also allows an athlete to become super well rounded and then peak any of those strength qualities that you might need. The key methods that came from the conjugate method or Louis' adaptation of this was number one, the max effort method. What this does is it builds absolute strength and high threshold motor unit recruitment. When you pair this with quality auto regulation tools like RPE or velocity tracking, it can actually sharpen both the physiology and the psychology of maximal strength. And that's why I believe a lot of people misunderstand the max effort method of like just maxing out every single day. And while it is, you need to require and push yourself to a certain level to actually get the most out of those high threshold motor units. If you're not working with auto regulation or holding yourself back in terms of RPE, it may actually do more harm than good. But when it is harnessed and when it is used correctly, the max effort method, there is nothing like it for building maximal strength and also peaking strength potential. You also get better at applying true effort, judging readiness, and building confidence under heavy loads, which we've seen some like crazy improvements, in short periods of time, say 4 to 8 weeks of just, take a relatively strong female lifter and each week we give her a max effort method. After about 4 to 8 weeks, we're just finding that she gets so much confidence and her strength just goes up and up. Then we have the dynamic method effort, okay? And this method essentially builds explosive speed and rate of force development. If you can move submaximal weights faster, you're also going to move more heavy weights easier. When you pair this with max effort work, it supercharges neural output and teaches you to be violently fast. And this is one of the beautiful qualities that we're starting to see a lot more emphasis on in the strength and conditioning world in particular, is that being able to be fast, being able to be explosive, being able to have those qualities of athletic performance. And the dynamic effort method is a brilliant system for that. Then we have the repetition method, okay, and this builds what it was used for is building hypertrophy or building muscle, structural balance, and muscular endurance. Now, the way I see it, and the way that was intended to is this is your glue. It's what holds everything together. It also builds the factory for strength. It reinforces your joints and it also has added size where you need it most. Say, for example, you may have a lagging muscle group. You can't just do more squats. Say you have lagging hamstrings or you're having knee issues. The repetition method is going to plug that gap, and it's going to be the glue that allows you to stay using those other more high-powered methods. GPP was, in my opinion, the most underrated weapon and in the Westside toolkit. Okay, and this is general physical preparedness. We're starting to see now a lot more studies are coming out where cardiovascular training or general conditioning work doesn't actually blunt or steal from your gains in terms of max effort, even hypertrophy. And the biggest reason why people sort of stayed away from the aerobic conditioning work is the opposite ends of what makes someone grow muscle or what makes someone's aerobically fit. And we have two enzymes. We have mTOR and we have AMPK. AMPK is actually stimulated more when we do more cardiovascular type efforts, okay, more aerobic type efforts. And essentially, this here will blunt mTOR, which is essentially the trigger for what triggers protein synthesis or muscle gain. So when those two are activated, they actually offset each other, and then you find that you may have blunting of the response of those two mechanisms. But when you use GPP work in the way that Westside Barbell did with things like sleds, carries, all of the work that's going to build that general physical preparedness programmed in the right way, you're actually going to take the capacities of that aerobic style training and then allow you to get more out of your max effort method, get more out of your dynamic, and get more out of your repetition methods. And in my opinion, when you do it right with the GPP, it is the most underrated weapon in the Westside toolkit. It builds your work capacity, it promotes recovery, it increases blood flow, and done right, it becomes the cardiovascular cheat code for strength athletes. Louie once said, "You're only as strong as your weakest link," and the conjugate method lets you target that link every single week. This method isn't random, it's targeted variation, and when done right, it's the most adaptable system ever created. Now, let's look at how you can actually program this, okay? And so the traditional Westside method for powerlifting was relatively straightforward, okay? And what it was two max effort days. So you'd have a upper day, you'd have a lower day where you max out. Okay, so you might do a max effort squat, you might do a max effort, cambered bar squat, you might do a max effort band squat, but you'd have a max effort lower day. Your max effort upper day generally is going to be a bench press of some variation. Then you would have two dynamic effort days with speed work with bands and chains. Okay, so this would either be the main lifts, and you'd use your bands and chains, so that you're doing somewhere around, anywhere between 40 to 60%, relatively light loads, but moving it very, very violently and fast. Okay. Then you'd have your high volume accessory work. Okay. So your repetition method for your weak points, and essentially you'd rotate max lifts weekly. You might go back squat into a front squat, into a safety bar squat, into a cambered bar squat. But basically, you'd adjust and rotate your lifts because they didn't want the adaptation to the same stimulus all the time. And that was, in my opinion, one of the things that made Westside incredible, but also was a little bit limited, especially for less advanced lifters. Having so much variation actually stops them from progressing. If you are doing those rotations weekly. But for extremely strong lifters, it can be something that, rotating lifts in and out can be brilliant for dropping that neural fatigue and also allowing them to adapt and adapt to the stimulus. Then we look at it, okay, so what are the limitations? It's not always specific enough for certain sports or certain athletes, okay? And, probably the big one would be Olympic lifters. If you're constantly varying a lift and an Olympic lift, you'll find that the technical aspects, you just don't quite fine tune it. For us, I've found that you can vary the lifts, but on a slower scale. Okay, so generally having lifts in your program for 3 to 6 weeks, and then rotating the lifts through different phases was much more better than rotating every day. High neurological demand can be tough for natural lifters, okay? If you're not good at auto regulation, you have a lot of stress, that high variation of both max effort methods, dynamic methods, and then also variation in the bars, that's going to add a lot of external stress to the lifter as well. And if you have a lot of external stress, there may be downsides and limitations to that. It doesn't really phase volume or intent based on seasonality or recovery needs, okay? And so what I truly believe, and I'll get more into this later, is that the way that this method is shown to the world in terms of Westside Barbell was perfect for that environment. But it's the underlying principles that allow this system to be adapted everywhere else. And Westside works incredibly well, but only if adapted intelligently. The brilliant wasn't in the chaos, it was in the systemized chaos. Okay. And so here's how we've used it in a more modern take and how we've adapted it to natural lifters, athletes, just recreational strength lifters. And we've taken the principles and allowed to apply this. And we've found that it was really, really cool. When I went to actually go and break down this video, I was like, holy shit, the way we do this is very, very exciting because we've taken a lot of the principles, a lot of the concepts, and we've allowed to just mold it into a system, what we essentially call the dial system. Okay. And so if you imagine a mixing board of all strength qualities, okay, so you've got maximal strength, you've got dynamic strength, you've got muscle, you've got GPP. Each of those little strength qualities throughout different phases of a program, you can turn them up or down based on, depending on the athlete's goal, fatigue levels, and the season you're in. Okay. And so this is a quick 16-week macro breakdown so that you can see how we turn each of those dials up. So in phase one, our main thing we want to work here is on anatomical adaptations in general. Generally, we want to, our athletes have either come off a peak phase, maybe they're coming into their preseason or anything like that. We want to get those anatomical adaptations in terms of structural tissue quality, neural capacity, and then also those qualities that allow us to layer more strength output later on down the program. So first of all, if we look at our max effort, okay, so in this first phase, we're still going to use the max effort method, but we will have a technical limiter lifts. So something that is in the same movement pattern, but something like a front squat, a hanging band squat, maybe a hanging band bench, something that because of the unstable or the difficulty of the exercise still allows us to use, say, a 5RM, a 3RM, but because of the intensity is still really high in terms of the max effort method, but the intentiveness, because of something like a Frankenstein squat being challenging in terms of the technical aspect, the relative load is still relatively low. So you're still keeping those neural adaptations. You're still teaching the things that matter in terms of the max effort method of getting better mind-muscle connection. You're also getting better neuromuscular connection. You're getting better technique improvements, and you're still getting that neural stimulus to build strength in those movement patterns. But because of the limiter in terms of the technical lift, we're actually able to limit the load that the athlete has, and we don't burn them out too soon. And the beautiful thing about that, then we can go and rotate lifts as we need and phase them out over the different ones. How we use dynamic effort in this early phase is we actually work on force absorption. So we know that later on in a program, we want to use the dynamic effort more and more and more, using more explosive methods, more plyometrics, more banded chain work. And we actually, in this first phase, we want to work on force absorption. So we'll do stuff like, drop jumps. We'll do some loaded stretching and stuff like that so that we can actually build the tissue capacity to be ready and prepared for the dynamic efforts later on down the track. Repetition method, we'll actually use long range or range of strength type movements with time under tension. Okay, so something like this, for example, could be a tempo ATG or long range split squat so that you're opening the hips, you're getting time under tension in terms of the joints and the tissues so that we can get more of a tissue adaptation rather than a muscular adaptation. But we will still use a lot of volume to start to prepare the body for those later on phases as well. Also in this sort of phase, in the first phase, we find that with our GPP work, okay, we start sessions with sleds or low intensity steady state or some sort of movement flow, okay? So this here is trying to give us a big aerobic capacity or a big aerobic base so that as we then go and force more adaptation through hypertrophy, through strength, through peak power, we have the available resources, we have the stress tolerance built up by improving things like our HRV and stuff like that using GPP later on down the track. We find that this phase just sets people up really, really well. And so for that anatomical adaptation, if we look at it, max effort, you're probably at about a 7 out of 10 in terms of the dial. Dynamic effort, you're probably about a 4 to 5 out of 10. There's not too much going on there. Repetition method is probably dialed up to like an 8. GPP, probably about a 7 or 8 as well, but nothing's really too hardcore there. Then into phase two, we actually go into a hypertrophy focus. So this is where we want to stack on as much muscle as we possibly can to build the factory to produce more strength and power later on down the track. So here we'll actually shift and rotate a new lifts in terms of our max effort for more stable lift progressions. In general, we're still going to work on the movement patterns that we want to build. You know, you got your squat pattern, your hinge, your bench press, your push, your rows. And we will pick an exercise generally here that is going to give us more of a stable lift progression. So instead of a front squat, instead of a Frankenstein squat, we'll probably use something like a Zercher squat or a front squat. Still to build up those quads, the upper back on a Zercher, the core, whatever we're trying to work on. And we may also start to bring in the main lifts as well, but at a lower intensity. So we'll do some sort of variation. And this is where I believe the conjugate variation method is actually really, really good in terms of this max effort here. So that dial, we're still probably about a 7. We're starting to tweak towards the 8 because we do want enough of those high threshold muscle fibers starting to be recruited. But we're not quite into our competition or our main peaking lifts. Dynamic effort, anything that moves fast here, we're starting to use hops, bounds, ballistic pairings, okay? And we find here we want to start to build that capacity to move fast, okay? And so take, for example, an intermediate, maybe like an advanced lifter who is strong but not quite quick. Using the dynamic effort method here by actually using stuff like plyometrics, hops, bounds, anything that might be like an isometric with something explosive straight after, we find out we start to improve the rate coding. We start to find out we improve the ability to actually move fast. And then when we go into our more explosive methods or more dynamic effort methods in the next phase, we really, really start to build that hardware and the software and the wiring so that the athlete can move fast. And what we start to find here is those max effort lifts with the stable progressions, they start to move really, really quickly. And that's when we know we're starting to get these adaptations that's going to set us up really, really well for our strength phase. Our repetition method here, obviously we're going to do targeted hypertrophy, and this is where we'll push the volume. We'll dial this repetition method up to about a 9 here. We really want to push the repetition method here. We're looking for things that are going to build joint integrity, okay? So 2-to-1 hamstring curls, you might even add in some bicep curls. You got your reverse hypers, a lot of stuff that's going to still, once again, build the tissue in terms of getting more muscle mass on, but also building tissue quality as well. Because with muscle, it is the factory, it is the wheelhouse that's going to allow you to have more potential for force, but it's also the body armor as well. And so this phase here is a pure focus on building the factory, building the body armor, and getting ready for those maximal strength and maximal power programs. GPP generally will start here with heavy sleds for anywhere between 45 to 90 seconds. So you're getting that lactate and growth factor accumulation. So you're still getting that hypertrophy work. And if you do a heavy sled, generally you're going to get those lower body strength gains as well, but you're also going to get a lot of blood flow and a lot of work into that lower body that's concentric only, so that you're not actually increasing fatigue, or you're not getting as much fatigue as, say, an eccentric method. And it can be brilliant to add extra volume and also extra potentiation work or extra strength work with sleds, and I absolutely love it. We also use a lot of carries here as well, because loaded carries are going to once again set you up with the hardware to be able to handle those bigger loads. So yoke walks, farmers carries, dead ball carries, all of that stuff that's just going to build some thickness of the athlete, also the trunk stiffness as well, and then also just those capacity of, especially if they're a team sport athlete, of being able to handle contact as well. So that is our phase 2. Then we go into phase 3, which is our maximal strength phase. And here's where you'd probably use something that looks more like a traditional conjugate style. And so in general, most of our lifters that we work with, okay, we've worked with anyone from a 60-year-old grandmother who started deadlifting at 60 years old, all the way up to world champion and world record holders, masters lifters. So we've worked with everyone in between. And most of the time, we'll find those first two phases set people up extremely well. Okay. And if you are someone who has a high skill level, high capacity for work, and is able to get the most out of their nervous system, you can almost add more of these maximal strength layers on top of each other. Okay. So we'll use a general strength phase, then we may go into a high intensity, high frequency strength phase and really peak that nervous system. But in a sense, it does look more like a traditional conjugate style. So obviously you got your max effort method. This is where we turn that dial to an 8 to 10. It's turned right up. Heavy compound lifts, and you'll use remedial primers here as well. Dynamic effort method, that once again is you're going to turn the dial up to that. You're probably looking at an 8 out of 10 now. You might be using something like weight releases with 60% on the bar, and then 80 to 100% on the weight releases. So really getting that dynamic speed work, bands, chains, anything that allows accommodating resistance, and we can do this in waves and stuff as well, to really make sure that as we push that max effort up, we're still staying in those velocity curves, so that we can still peak out that maximal strength and continue to drive force throughout the phase. Then the repetition method, okay? And a couple of thoughts of this is like repetition method here for us. This is where we want to keep the athlete in one piece, okay? So the bodybuilding work, the high rep work, it's our joint healing, it's our body armor, and we want to make sure that we maintain this. And I do believe a lot of people will sub this out because they don't want to put in too much volume. Okay. And obviously if you're putting most of your resources to your max effort work, to your dynamic work, it's hard to fit in extra repetition method. Like let's say you've got anywhere between 5 to 10 sets on your max effort work. That could take anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes, depending on how strong you are. And so to go and add on an extra 30 minutes of repetition work it's just not the go. But what we found to work really, really well here is high rep band work. Okay, so beautiful thing about high rep band work, obviously you're getting a lot of blood flow and flushing to the joints. It does give you enough of that lactate and growth factor to get a hypertrophy stimulus, but also the high volume band work as well, as it does improve tendon quality as well, because tendons, they need a lot of load with a lot of volume, or not necessarily a lot of load, but they need to be loaded often with a lot of volume. And so the high rep band work, 50 to 100 reps, can be something that just keeps the joints in one piece. So think about anything that moves in the joint. That's where you're going to put your band work in this, and it doesn't tax the nervous system too much, and it's very, very easy to recover from. Can also be done as a great warm-up as well. Our GPP here is generally we will use plyometrics or strength endurance work just to keep that speed, keep that pop, keep that plyometric, that reactiveness in our athletes. Okay, and we found this, if we keep this in here, we might use something like a build to a 3 rep max box jump before a max effort squat. And we'll just find that it primes and sets up the lifter. And we've had so many PBs from using those plyometrics in terms of that we just find that it's just a method that we love to keep in there, and we just adjust where we put these methods. So then we come into our fourth phase, and this is something where I've picked up and been inspired heavily by Travis Mash. And Travis Mash was a a great advocate for Louie' system, and he sort of took it and brought it into the weightlifting world a lot more. And we'll use this phase. Say, for example, if we had a powerlifter, that maximal strength phase is where their peaking is going to finish. Okay. You'll be able to use a peaking phase, whatever you need to. But let's say we've got a weightlifter or a team sport athlete. Okay. And what we want to do here is we want to peak power, because when you peak strength and power at the same time, it's actually very taxing. It's something that, when you want to peak, say, the Olympic weightlifting and the strength, the amount of work it takes to peak a squat and then also go and peak something like a heavy clean and jerk, it's just very, very demanding. And we just find that if you peak those two things at the same time, you burn out and you risk that CNS fatigue. But because we've taken all of those first three prior phases and then now taking it into our peak power, our peak speed, or anything that allows us to build the qualities of the athlete that we want to see in terms of a dynamic fashion, we find that this peak phase is absolutely incredible. So what it looks like is we still have the max effort method, but we have high intensity, low intensivity lifts. Okay, so this might be a 90% plus squat variation without the emotional strain. So instead of like, hey, today I'm going to go and get you to max out on a 1 rep max back squat. Okay, it might be like, hey, I just want you to do a 1 rep max front squat at a 7 RPE with a 4 second pause in the bottom. Okay, beautiful thing about that, opens the hips, gives them some added mobility, also improves your postural strength, but it's not super, super heavy compared to something like, a heavy back squat. Okay. But what you can also do too is respect the fact that, like, if you do a heavy back squat a couple of days before you go and do something like a heavy snatch, you are probably going to have that potentiation effect. So keeping that max effort in, you're probably going to dial this down though to about an 8, maybe like a 7, to make sure that you're still keeping that nervous system fired up. But you just want to make sure that you're still not taking away from what you're trying to really develop here, which is the peak power. Dynamic effort, okay? And so this is where we might ramp this up for really high intensity, but really low volume. Okay, so plyometrics, Olympic lifts for really, really fast, just enough to make sure the speed doesn't die. Okay, even with the max effort method, you're going to max out snatches, cleans, anything that's fast, maybe a trap bar jump, sprints, high velocity work. Dynamic effort method, that's in there to keep the speed and power. Now then we have our repetition. We still want it to be minimal, so we're probably dialing this back down to about a 6 or a 7 now. It's more for remedial, just to keep the athlete in one piece, okay? And this is to keep those joints feeling good, and it's really, really good. GPP, we trend towards recovery and tissue prep here, and most of the effort is going to go into the max effort in terms of the speed lifts that we want, but it doesn't look like a max effort as like the traditional strength method would look like. As Travis Mash put this, the problem with peaking comp lifts and strength work at the same time is recovery. They fight each other. We need our athletes fresh, so we shift the focus, but we keep that signal of heavy, heavy lifting so that we can still make sure that nervous system's fired up. Beautiful thing about the way that we write these phases is every phase is built on this belief. Train what matters most, but never forget the rest. And that's how we've essentially taken the Westside concept, some of those methods, and build it into what we use for our limitless athletes. Louie Simmons' system wasn't flawless, but in my opinion, that's exactly what made it genius. He didn't chase perfect programs, he chased perfect execution. Louis understood his lifters, okay? He understood his environment, and he squeezed every last kilo from what he had. That's the real lesson. I believe that if we're all able to sit down with Louis and have a chat with him, and what an amazing experience that would be. You'd be able to go so deep into the complexities and understandings of why he applied everything. And you just realize, like, what we see on the internet, what we see on, the West Side versus the World movie, that method was his passion was powerlifting, but his thought process, his methodology, his principles, they can apply to anything. And so the conjugate method isn't just a training model; it's a way of thinking. You got to adapt, you got to solve problems, and you obsess over the weak links. Innovate without losing direction, and you'll find that Louis didn't just give us bands and box squats. He gave us a blueprint for coaching mastery. And the more you study his work, the more you realize his legacy wasn't just about breaking records. It was about rising standards for programming, for coaching, and for lifters who want to build something that lasts. And so, if this system makes sense to you and you're ready to train smarter, faster, and harder without burnout, give it a crack. And if you would love to experience this, just comment Westside below and I will send you a 2 week example of how we run this system with our athletes in the modern day. Hope you found that useful. Let me know in the comments.